The Southern Poverty Law Center, an Introduction, by Peter G. Gemma. In 1971, the Southern Poverty Law Center was incorporated by Alabama lawyers Morris Dees and Joseph Levin as a tax-exempt charitable organization under Section 501c3 of the IRS Code, making all contributions to SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, tax deductible. According to its website, the Southern Poverty Law Center claims to be a watchdog over, quote, hate groups and racial extremists throughout the United States, close quote. There is substantial evidence documented in this issue of The Social Contract that SPLC is a radical left-wing organization with an extremist agenda of its own. Contrary to the organization's cultivated image as a, quote, civil rights organization dedicated to fighting hate and bigotry and seeking justice for the most vulnerable members of society, close quote, Harper's Magazine notes that SPLC's, quote, entire legal staff quit in protest of Dee's refusal to address issues such as homelessness, voter registration, and affirmative action that they considered far more pertinent to poor minorities because they are far less marketable to affluent benefactors, close quote. Harper's also reported that another lawyer, Gloria Brown, who resigned a few years later, stated that SPLC's programs were calculated to cash in on, quote, black pain and white guilt. Commentator Don Feder, F-E-D-E-R, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in an article that appeared in Front Page magazine, wrote, what makes the Southern Poverty Law Center particularly odious is its habit of taking legitimate conservatives and jumbling them with genuine hate groups, the Klan, Aryan Nation, skinheads, etc., to make it appear that there is a logical relationship between, say, opposing affirmative action and lynching, or demands for an end of government services for illegal aliens and attacks on dark-skinned immigrants. The late novelist philosopher Ayn Rand called this the broad brush smear. Just for the note, I don't know if Aryan Nation or most skinhead groups do condone lynching of blacks for being black, or I don't know if they condone race-based violence, but just pointing that out. The Capital Research Center reports that the SPLC, quote, has mastered the art of inflaming racial passions, and in doing so it undermines Americans' confidence in the nation's racial progress. SPLC's activism may be too profitable an enterprise for it to give up, but it can have a corrosive effect on our politics, close quote. Here's how the SPLC describes its finances, quote, our work is made possible by the generosity and commitment of our thousands of supporters across the country. We are proud of our financial stewardship and dedicated to ensuring openness and accountability, close quote. But the American Institute for Philanthropy's December 2008 Charity Ratings Guide gave the Southern Poverty Law Center an F rating. The Baltimore Sun characterizes SPLC operations this way, quote, its business is fundraising, and its success at raking in cash is based on its ability to sell gullible people on the idea that present-day America is awash in white racism and anti-Semitism, which it will fight tooth and nail as a public interest law firm it purports to be, close quote. In addition, a March 2007 article in Harper's Magazine noted, quote, the center earns more from its vast investment portfolio than it spends on its core mission, which has led Millard Farmer, a death penalty lawyer in Georgia, to once describe Morris Dees, the SPLC's head, as the Jim and Tammy Faye of the civil rights movement, later adding, I don't mean to malign Jim and Tammy Faye, close quote. SPLC hometown newspaper, the Montgomery Advertiser, won a journalism award for a series of investigative articles on the unethical fundraising practices of Dees and the Southern Poverty Law Center, titled, A Complex Man, Opportunist or Crusader. The articles noted that in a 10-year period, between 1984 and 1994, the SPLC spent some $40 million, or two-thirds of its income, on its own expenses. The newspaper quoted Pamela Summers, a former SPLC legal fellow, as saying, quote, what they are doing in the legal department is not done for the best interest of everybody, but is done as though the sole overriding goal is to make money. They're drowning in their own affluence." Close quote. The SPLC has earned critics from the left, right, and center. Cornell University professor William A. Jacobson has observed, quote, "I regularly donated to the SPLC. I stopped those donations long ago as the SPLC drifted from its original mission into left-wing politics." Close quote. Across the political spectrum, there are sources who have investigated and refuted SPLC's claim. The Humanist magazine asserts that, quote, "The SPLC campaigns for laws that will effectively deny free speech and freedom of association to certain groups of Americans on the basis of their beliefs. 6 times a year, the SPLC's letter boasts. The Center reports its finding to over 6,000 law enforcement agencies. Then, with no discernible irony, it goes on to justify its Big Brother methods in the name of tolerance." Close quote. Reason magazine, a monthly libertarian publication, contends, quote, "The Southern Poverty Law Center would paint a box of Wheaties as an extremist threat if it thought that would help it raise funds." Close quote. Wesley Pruden, retired editor-in-chief of the conservative Washington Times newspaper, has this to say of the SPLC and Morris Dees, quote, "White guilt can be manipulated with black pain, but it has to be done carefully. It's a sordid scam. Some people would call what Morris Dees does a hate crime, but it's a living and a very good one." Close quote. The SPLC is the brainchild of Morris Dees and Joseph J. Levin. Dees has a curious background. The SPLC website describes him as having, quote, "won a series of groundbreaking civil rights cases that helped integrate government and public institutions," close quote. But the left-wing Progressive magazine reported that, quote, "Dees served in 1958 as a state campaign manager for segregationist Attorney General candidate McDonald Gallion, and also worked for George C. Wallace," close quote. In 1961, according to Progressive contributor John Edgerton, when some civil rights activists were beaten by a white mob at a Montgomery bus station, Dees and his law partner took the case of the men charged, and the legal fee was paid by the Ku Klux Klan. The inconsistencies abound. As Jim Tharp of the Montgomery Advertiser said of its SPLC investigations, quote, "There was a problem with black employees at what was the nation's richest civil rights organization. There were no blacks in the top management positions. 12 out of the 13 black current and former employees who we contacted cited racism at the center, which was a shocker to me." Close quote. These are only a few of the many contradictions and controversies associated with the Southern Poverty Law Center. The radical organization wants to position itself as the ombudsman for those it deems abused by what it defines as extremists. SPLC purports to be a repository of impartial research for the public and even government entities. And later on, that's really important and really dangerous. Article continues. But their corporate and individual connections paint quite a different picture. There is another side to the SPLC story, a slick operation with an ideological agenda run by zealots who utilize questionable fundraising practices, and you will read all about this in this special edition of The Social Contract. I saw a video by a guy named Reckless Tortuga, is his username, and he had a video entitled "Racism in the Elevator," and it got a lot of views. It's a pretty old video, but it got a lot of views and a lot of people watching it. And the point of the video was that in an elevator, for example, or in any confined space where there's a white person in a confined space with a member of one of the dangerous races, be they black or Hispanic or whatever, that the white person will, for example, a woman with a purse will clutch the purse, or a woman, or, will be the white person will be just a little bit, in a position that if an attack comes, they'll be prepared. And it's subtle, but he says that he notices it, or he says we noticed it. I guess he is speaking on behalf of the various races who are prone to this response. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that this is true. Now, what would he have us do? What would he have white people do? What is the implication of this? Well, the implication of this is that you should stop, right? That is, you should put his feelings, the way he feels about your response to him, over and above your playing the odds, so to speak, in terms of safety. And I mean playing the odds because, yes, it's true, blacks and Hispanics, for example, do commit more violent crimes. Blacks about 7 times as much, Hispanics about 3 times as much as white people. And I'm not talking about drug crimes, I'm talking about violent crimes. Some people may say, well, it's not true, it's because of the justice system is biased. I'll have a link to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which shows that year in, year out, that's false. Unless, of course, the entire American public is in on this grand scheme to victimize black people, or to make it appear that blacks and Hispanics are committing more crimes, even though a lot of the people who are victims of crimes are themselves black and Hispanics, and they'll report like the race of the offender, and they virtually always correspond with the police reports. So the evidence is that blacks and Hispanics are not profiled in terms of violent crime. Maybe in terms of drug crime, maybe in terms of traffic violations, I don't know. But in terms of violent crime, not the case. And the human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. And the human brain can seek the most subtle patterns. And a lot of people will have little bigotries against someone who have beards. Like, I have a little bit of a bigotry against people who have beards. I think people who have beards, I immediately see them and I think there's a greater likelihood that this person is an asshole if he has a beard. Maybe not. Maybe he has like a really short chin or has some frog lips and he has a beard to cover that up. But my general experience has been that people with beards are a little bit more asshole-ish than people without beards. This is not always true, okay, but it's a little tendency, it's a little pattern that my brain has recognized, whether or not that's true or false. And the brain finds the smallest patterns and generalizes on them. If it is true in a person's experience that black people are just a little bit more violent, then the brain, being an expert pattern-creating machine, oftentimes making patterns when there are none, the brain is going to do that. And lastly, if you look at implicit association studies, even black people are slightly biased against black people. And I would assume that if a black person is in a confined space in like an elevator or whatever with another black person, that black person will also, rear up a little bit in case of a conflict. Just as a white person would. Maybe not as much, but that a black person would in fact do that. Would we say that the black person is racist against other blacks? Or would we say that the black person, like the white person, is just being rational and just playing the odds and doesn't give a damn, nor should they give a damn, how that makes you feel? There is no substitute for an argument. Strategy that a lot of people will use is they will appeal to being official. We are the official answer. And they will try to accumulate for themselves the trappings of authority and the trappings of institution. They will form institutions for long periods of time with the idea, well, it's been around for a long time, there must be something to it. They will try to get titles, try to become the heads of organizations, heads of government organizations. And from these, they can then make pronouncements. Now, most people don't have time to look into issues, whatever issue it may be. They don't have time to look into it. It's much easier for them to seek out the authorities. Seek out the authorities and then just get the answer from them. Listen, what does the authority have to say? They're the authority. They seem to be the kind of people who would know the most. They have all of the trappings of legitimacy, all of the trappings of authority. So we should just listen to them. Well, that's what people think. Now, I'm just saying that. I think it's pretty obvious the dangers of that. But it's also important to keep in mind that that is a strategy that is used. Okay? Because we know that people will often just will just appeal to what the authorities try to say. A strategy for advancing an ideology will be just to get in those positions of authority, however it is done. And once in those positions of authority, then you can simply make pronouncements. You don't even have to make arguments. You don't have to go through the long, woolly, dealing with objections and all that stuff. You simply make pronouncements, and as the authority, many people will listen to you because you are in the position of authority. You can make the pronouncements. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. A lot of people, even in high school, have been in small positions of authority, being like the head, being like the organizer of some dance, and then saying something, and people will just listen to you because you are the head. You are designated as like the punch bowl organizer. Or I've done a thing where I've gone around my church back when I was a Christian, and there was a debate on a service. There was a youth group service that we were going to do on Sunday one day, and there was a lot of debate about what the organization, what the schedule of this service was going to be. And so what I did, because I knew that people fall for the trappings of authority, I went upstairs, got they had new printers, right? There's not new printers, but they had regular printers, and then they had those old printers, with the perforated holes going up along the side. I took some of that paper, okay, and I printed off a schedule for the sermon, and I printed it off in Courier font, the typewriter kind of font. Printed off in Courier font in the middle of the page. Not in the top left corner, but kind of in the middle of the page, and then printed off a bunch of that, and then handed out that schedule to everyone in the youth group, and then everyone immediately went along with that schedule, as if that was somehow officially decided, because it looked kind of official. It's amazing how people will fall for, titles and heads of organizations and things like that. Now, what's the point? What's the point of this? Well, keep in mind that this is a strategy used to demonize opponents. Demonize your ideological opponents. For example, rural whites. It is okay to be bigoted against rural whites. It is okay to make jokes about rural whites, about rural whites being stupid, about rural whites being evil, about rural whites just attacking blacks for no reason. Okay? And these things are all false. And I will later make videos explaining this and explaining this kind of this pathological hatred of rural whites. But this is a demonization strategy. So demonize the opposition and caricature them. So you caricature them, so then you have a stark contrast. The caricatured, evil, dumb, dirty rural whites. And then you have them, the new mandarins, in these positions of power. Now, then what happens is then you get people like me, or people like Jared Taylor, who actually make arguments against what I call race terrorism. And as I may have said before, I don't quite remember because I've done multiple takes and they're all flowing together. But when I say race terrorism, that's not just an off-the-cuff slur. Okay, I have a real reason why I call them race terrorists, because their strategy is to terrorize the opposition. Anyway, the strategy is to then say, well, these people who are arguing against us, they are racist, or I don't know, what they mean by racist. Everyone has a different definition of racist. Their arguments, they're making all these arguments. They're making all these arguments against descriptive equality. Okay, they're making arguments against forced wealth transfers, race-based forced wealth transfers. They're making arguments against racial privilege and racial quotas. They're making arguments against forced association, and making arguments against empire and against people being forced into a political unit that they don't want to be a part of. Right? They're making arguments against all of these things, which arguments that I make. But what they will do is they will try to say that these arguments, don't listen to these arguments, okay? Because these arguments are nothing more than the outgrowth of this primitive, dumb, dirty, evil, rural white. That's what they try to do. They try to say, this is just the, racism in a suit and tie. It's just a gussied up version of this, primitive, degraded rural white. And so that's what they do to try to dismiss the arguments. And being in these positions of authority, that enables them to do that. That enables them to make these pronouncements and draw that association. We are up here. They are down there. Therefore, don't even listen to them. And these people here who are making arguments, don't listen to them because they really stem from that. Okay? So, just recognize that that is their strategy. That is what they're going to do. That is what they always do. And also remember that there is no substitute for an argument. This is going to be a reading of An Open Letter to White People, which was published by Tim Wise on his website on November 3rd, 2010, after the Republicans gained a bunch of seats in the primary election. Tim Wise is required reading at many universities and is a self-proclaimed anti-racist. Tim Wise wrote this letter, but then took it down from his site and reposted a censored and cleaned up version of it later on. But that was too late. Many had already seen the letter and had already copied it, and his impulsive reaction to the midterm elections, in my opinion, reveals that Tim Wise simply hates white people, simply. And I believe that you will hold the same opinion after reading this letter or just listening to me read it verbatim. Starts off. For all y'all rich folks, enjoy that champagne or whatever fancy-ass scotch you drink. And for all ya a bit lower on the economic scale, enjoy your Pabst Blue Ribbon or whatever shitty-ass beer you favor. Whatever the case, and whatever your economic station, know this. You need to drink up, and quickly, and heavily, because your time is limited. Real damn limited. So party while you can, but mind the increasingly loud clock ticking away in the corners of your consciousness. That clock reminds you how little time you and yours have left. Yours, what does he mean? He means your children. Not much more now. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. I know, you think you've taken your country back with this election, and of course you have always thought it was yours for the taking. Because that's what we white folks are bred to believe, that it's ours, and how dare anyone else say otherwise. But you are wrong. You have won a small battle in a larger war, the meaning of which you do not remotely understand. Because there is nothing even slightly original about you. There have always been those who wanted to take their country back. There are those who in the past years wanted to take the country back to a time of enslavement and indentured servitude. But they lost. There were those who wanted to take us back to the time when children could work in the mines and factories. This is child labor myths, or the mythology that it was ended with legislation. Continue. When workers had no legal rights to speak of, when the skies in every major city were heavy with industrial soot that would gather on the sidewalks and windowsills like volcanic ash. But they lost. There are those who want to take us back to a time when women could not vote, or attend any but a few colleges, or get loans in their own names, or start their own businesses. But they lost. There are those who wanted to take us back to a time when blacks had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. This being the official opinion of the Supreme Court before those awful days of judicial activism, now decried by the likes of you. And when people of color could legally be kept from voting solely because of race, or holding certain jobs, or living in a certain neighborhood, or run out of other towns altogether when the sun would go down, or be strung up from trees. But they lost, and you will lose. So make a note of it. Tweet it to yourself. Put it on your Facebook wall and leave it there so you'll remember what I told you so. It is coming, and soon. This isn't hubris. It isn't ideology. It is not wishful thinking. It is math. Not even advanced math, just simple, basic, like third grade math. The kind of math that proves how your kind, mostly older white folks, beholden to an absurd, inaccurate, nostalgic fantasy of what America used to be like, are dying. You're like the bad guy in every horror movie ever made, who gets shot 5 times, or stabbed 10, or blown up twice, and who will eventually pass, even if it takes 4 sequels to make it happen, but who in the meantime keeps coming back around, grabbing at our ankles as we walk by. We haven't been mistakenly convinced that you are finally dead this time. Fair enough, have at it, but remember how this movie ends. Our ankles survive, you do not. Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason, and that asshole husband in the movie with Julia Roberts who tracks her down after she runs away and changes her identity, they're all gone. Even that crazy fucker in Saw is about to be finished off for good. Granted, he's going to be popping out in some 3D shit to scare the kiddies, so he isn't going to go quietly. But he's going, as all bad guys eventually do. And in the pantheon of American history, old white people have pretty much always been the bad guys. The keepers of the hegemonic and reactionary flame, the folks unwilling to share the category of American with others on equal terms. Fine, keep it up. It doesn't matter, because you're on the endangered list. And unlike, say, the bald eagle or some exotic species of muskrat, you are not worth saving. In 40 years or so, maybe fewer, there won't be any more white people around who actually remember that Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Opie Taylor down at the fishing pole, Carmpone bullshit that you hold so near and dear to your heart. There won't be any more white folks around who think the 1950s were the good old days, because there won't be any more white folks who actually remember them. And so therefore we'll all be able to teach them accurately and honestly without hurting your precious feelings, or those of the so-called greatest generation, a bunch whose white members were by and large a gaggle of miscreants who helped save the world from fascism only to return home and oppose the ending of it here, by doing nothing to lift a finger on behalf of the civil rights struggle. So to hell with you, and all who revere you. By then, half the country will be black or brown, and there is nothing you can do about it. Nothing, Signor Tancredo. Nothing, Signora Angele, Signor Brewer, Signor Beck. Lloyd tiene muy mal, hijo de puta. And by then, you will have gone all in as a white nationalist movement. Hell, you've all but done that by now, thus guaranteeing that the folks of color, even a decent-sized minority of us white folks, will be able to crush you, election after election, from the presidency on to down to the 8th grade student council. Like I said, this shit is math, baby, and numbers don't lie. Bottom line, this too shall pass. So enjoy your tax cuts a while longer. Go buy whatever you people buy when your taxes get cut. A new car or two, a bigger house, an island, whatever. Go back to trading your derivatives, engaging in rampant financial speculation that provides nothing of value, that turns the whole world into your personal casino, whatever. Play your hand. For the love of God, play it big, real big. As in shoot for the moon big, as in try to privatize Social Security and healthcare and everything else. Whatever. At least that way everyone will be able to see what you're really about. We've been trying to tell them, but nothing beats seeing it with your own eyes. So, go big or go home, Bubba. Get her done, cowboy up, or whatever other stupid-ass catchphrases strike your fancy. Just promise you'll do more than talk this time, please. Or as one of your celluloid heroes might put it, make my day. Do whatever you got to do, but remember that those who are victims of your greed and indifference take the long view. They know, but you do not, that justice is not for the sprinters, but rather for the long-distance runners who will be hitting their second wind right about the time that you collapse from exhaustion. They are like the tortoise to your hare. They are like the San Francisco Giants to your New York Yankees. A bunch of losses year after year after year until they finally win. You have had this confidence before, remember? You thought you had secured your position permanently after the overthrow of the Reconstruction in the wake of the Civil War, after the elimination of the New Deal, after the Reagan Revolution, after the Republican electoral victory of 1994. Yet, they who refuse to die are still here. Because those who have lived on the margins, who have been abused, maligned, targeted by austerity measure and budget cuts, subjected to racism, classism, sexism, straight supremacy, and every other form of oppression, always know more about their abusers than the abusers know about their victims. They have to study you, to pay careful attention, to adjust their body armor accordingly, and to memorize your sleep patterns. You, on the other hand, need to know nothing whatsoever about them, and this will surely prove fatal to you in the end. For it means that you do not know their resolve, will not fear it as you should. It means you will take their greatest strength, perseverance, and make of it a weakness, called losing. But what you forget, or more to the point, what you never knew, is that those who lose know how to lose, which is to say they know how to lose with dignity. And those who suffer know how to suffer, which is to say they know how to survive, a skill that is in short supply amid the likes of you. You, who could not survive the thought of minimal health care reform or financial regulation or a marginal tax rate equal to that which you paid just 10 years earlier. That's a lie, but whatever. Perhaps you are under the illusion that everyone is as weak as you, as soft as you, as akin to petulant children as you are, as unable to cope with the smallest setback, the slightest challenge to the way you think your country should look and feel and operate. But surprise, they are not. And they know how to regroup, and plot, and plan, and they are planning even now. We are your destruction. And I do not mean by that your physical destruction. We don't play those games. We're not into the whole Second Amendment remedy, militia, armed resistance bullshit that your side fetishizes, because, see, we don't have to be. We don't need guns. We just have to be patient and wait for your hearts to stop beating. And stop they will. And for some of you, real damn soon, truth be told. Do you hear it? The sound of your empire dying, your nation as you knew it ending permanently? Because I do, and the sound of its demise is beautiful. So know this, if the thought of this election was payback for 2008, remember, payback, thy name is temporary. So, hopefully that gives some insight into what truly motivates Tim Wise. Just a little factoid. I'm not sure how relevant this is. Tim Wise is Jewish. I don't know if being Jewish causes him to view other whites as like an out-group. And so, like there's a theory going around that Tim Wise is actually Jewish, and because he's Jewish, he doesn't identify himself as being white, even though a lot of people consider Jews as a type of white. And so what he's doing is he's pretending to be white in order to attack white people because he hates white people. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that he does, in fact, hate white people. I think this letter makes it abundantly clear. Even in this kind of impulsive letter, he, every once in a while, he'll try to say, I'm only talking about, conservative whites, which is like most white people. So even though he will limit it from time to time, you can just tell with this letter that he's not, he hates white people. And he has a very odd view of the past. Anyway, I don't want to get into any discussions about things that he said were wrong, about exaggerations about white racism in the past, exaggerations about Jim Crow laws. I'll have plenty of videos about that I just wanted to do this to read Tim Wise's letter to perhaps provide an insight as to the anti-white racism that really just pops out at you here. The mythology of civil rights. I want to compare two stories. One is the American Dream, and the other is the Pageant of the Christ. You've all probably heard these stories. The American Dream is one of possibility, and this story doesn't necessarily have a main character, or more, the main character is you, whoever you are. It's really about you, being able to make your way in the world, being able to start your own business, perhaps, to self-actualize. It's about autonomy, achievement, and being able to make a living doing something you love. Then there is the Pageant of the Christ, and this story is about something being done by someone else, or a one-time thing that then leads to utopia. It's not a process that you are doing constantly all the time. No, it is something that is done that then leads to utopia. For Christ, it's that Christ dies for your sins. If you accept his sacrifice, you get to go to heaven, where you will be in perfect bliss forever once you die. It should be obvious that political salvation stories more closely mirror the Pageant of the Christ than they mirror the more probabilistic, uncertain, market-based story of the American Dream. The communist story is that once communism is achieved, the state will wither away and man will be happier than ever before in a earthbound utopia. Or a multicultural story is that as soon as we get rid of white racism and all of the things associated with white racism, including any sane economic policy, get rid of that and then have the state manage society as if society were like some machine where you could just pull levers and make things work differently. Do all that, and then everything will get better. Perhaps not, they don't promise as much of a utopia as the communists did, but they promise something utopian-ish. Now forget that this is precisely the trajectory that the entire Western world is on, and that even a fool can see that the entire Western world is heading toward disaster. Blacks in the U.S. are the most religious major racial group, far more religious than either whites or Hispanics or definitely Asians. They truly embrace the salvation through Christ idea. And this story is mirrored in a secular way in the salvation through the state story of the civil rights movement. Now, I am not a fan of the Jim Crow laws. I don't want to give that impression. In fact, I oppose the state in its entirety. I don't want to get into that here. That's a separate topic for a separate time. But we must keep in mind that most blacks remained in the South during the Jim Crow era. They wouldn't have even had to deal with immigration or customs because they would just be moving to a different area within the same country. For example, if they were moving from Alabama to Michigan, they wouldn't have to apply for citizenship in Michigan. They could just go there. Right? They'd have to find a job and relocate and all that stuff. And so that's a hassle. Moving is a hassle. But they wouldn't be even going into another country. Now, by their own actions, we know that the inconvenience of moving was greater than the inconvenience of segregation. Now, this may seem like a shocking thing to say, but it is true. This is true. It cannot be denied. If the inconvenience of moving was less than the inconvenience of segregation, more would have moved. Most stayed in the South because segregation was not as much of an inconvenience as moving. And another thing to keep in mind is that there were no walls preventing blacks from leaving the South. In fact, if a black person said he wanted to take his family back to Africa or something, he would probably find many whites who would eagerly help him pack. Compare this to places like North Korea or the Soviet Union, which built walls to keep people in. That's what real oppressive regimes have to do. They have to take measures, either build a wall or whatever, in order to keep people in. The Jim Crow South did not do any of that. And real oppression doesn't mean fire hoses and attack dogs, which are regularly used against protesters all around the world, including in Western Europe. And in the G4 protests, they did some similar things. What's else is that the black-white income gap has remained virtually unchanged since 1959. And this is in spite of repealing laws, forcing racial segregation, making it illegal to racially segregate or discriminate with your own business, and along with a cavalcade of small advantages, quotas, and affirmative actions in universities, government contracts, and labor laws. So, if segregation was really so bad, how come it hasn't had much of an effect on the income gap? Well, we already know the answer to that. Because unlike the Israelites who actually fled Egypt, because, as the story goes, it was really so bad, most blacks were unwilling to take the effort to leave. Now, of course, forced segregation was a bad thing. We can all agree on that. Even white nationalists would, for the most part, agree that forced segregation is a bad thing. But forced integration is also a bad thing. It's not helping racial tensions. In fact, whites in integrated schools tend to develop more negative views of blacks and Hispanics than whites who have less contact with blacks and Hispanics. That is, the more contact whites have with blacks and Hispanics, the more negative their views of them tend to be. Moreover, the Milwaukee voucher study seems to show that the quality of school really doesn't matter to a certain point. I guess if the kids didn't have pencils or books, that would be a problem, but you reach a point of diminishing returns. And students who apply for vouchers and get them do no better than students who apply for vouchers but don't get them. And I think this is something deep down everyone already knows, is that as long as the basics are provided, the quality of the school really doesn't matter. Which is why the gains expected from desegregating schools have not materialized. What's happening is that better students tend to go to the same schools, creating the illusion that the school itself is producing these students. And that's just not true. Then there's the lynching myth. From Richard M. Perloff, professor of communications at Cleveland State University, he says, quote, approximately 4,742 individuals were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Of the victims, 3,445, or 73% of the lynching victims, were black. Now, if we recognize that lynching was a way violent crime was dealt with in rural southern areas, we can compare this to violent crime by race in the U.S. today. There were 16,277 perpetrators of murder and non-negligible homicide reported by law enforcement agencies to the FBI in 2008. Of the 11,557 cases in which the race of the perpetrator was known, or 71%, 5,941 were black, making up 51.4% of the known perpetrators. There were 2,487 arrests for rape in the U.S. in 2008, 801, or 32.2% of the perpetrators were black. 65.2% were quote-unquote white, though this statistic is useless since Hispanics are lumped in with whites. There are 42,779 arrests for assault in the U.S. in 2008. 14,630, or 34.2% of the perpetrators were black. 63.3% were quote white, close quote, again worthless since Mexicans are lumped in with the stats. Blacks made up 21,372 of the 56,823 violent crimes, excluding robbery in 2008, or 37.6% in the U.S. in total. In 2006, blacks made up 13.5% of the U.S. population. So presuming that the states in which lynchings occurred, the racial demographics were identical to what they are now in the U.S. as a whole, we should expect about 35% to 39% of the lynchings to have involved black people. And what was the actual number? 73%. But, a few things to consider. One, there are more blacks as a percentage of the population in the states which had lynchings, the South. If there were twice as many blacks as a percentage of the population, then something between 70% and 78% is about what we would expect as the percentage of the number of people who are being lynched. 2. There are also very few Hispanics between 1882 and 1968 in the South, which means that the whites really were what we would consider whites today. And so the white violent crime rate wasn't artificially inflated by including Hispanics in the white category. For this reason, I do not believe blacks are systematically targeted, or were systematically targeted by lynch mobs, any more than the current legal system systematically targets blacks. That is, the lynch mobs discriminated based on race no more than the current legal system does. So, we are left with a choice. Either the current U.S. legal system is precisely as racist as the Southern lynch mobs, or both the Southern lynch mobs and the U.S. legal system are, for the most part, impartial when it comes to race and generally accurate. This is not to mean that Southerners back then didn't have animosity or poor views of black people, just that that despite these views, they ended up getting justice just about right. And if you interact with people from the South, this intuitively makes sense because people in the South are a very honor-based culture and a very strong sense of justice. And also, if you talk with white nationalists a lot, what you'll find is that they're very interested in fairness and justice and in treating other racial blocs with fairness. Right? They have a high level of that kind of honor culture thing.
I think that the business of hating Negroes is insane. I think that the Negro people have been cruelly used. They've been exploited. We drag them over here against their will. At the same time, I think that as a matter of practical experience, it's been proved that the majority of Negroes, the vast majority, simply can't fit in modern urban society. And therefore, I go along with Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and even Abraham Lincoln, all of whom preached that the only solution is geographical separation. We should arrange to get them some area in Africa, build it up for them decently. You can't throw them over there in the jungle. Build it up decently and give them a country of their own, just like our pilgrims came here and made their own country when where they were not wanted. The Jews are about 90% of the force behind the Negro-Black Revolution. Every time you find the lawyers and the people who are pushing the Negroes in where they're not wanted, you find it's Greenbergs and Moskowitz and like the Jewish boys that were murdered down there in Mississippi. I just got back from Mississippi a couple of days ago, and it's just full of CORE and COFO workers who are Jewish from New York and from the big cities. So I feel if the Jews love them so much, why don't we give them to them?
I know that a lot of people don't want to hear that, right? Because they have conditioned to believe that rural whites, especially rural whites in the South, are inhuman. That is what they have believed. But strip away the mythology, strip away the anecdote, strip away the anti-rural white bigotry, and let's move away from story time and just look at the facts. Most blacks chose to remain in the southern U.S. during segregation. By this, we know that the inconvenience of moving was greater than the inconvenience of segregation for most blacks. The lynching statistics show no greater racial bias than exists in the current U.S. legal system. If the current U.S. legal system is generally unbiased, then neither were the lynching statistics. The lynch mobs. The black-white income gap has not changed since repealing the segregation laws, and desegregating schools has not resulted in significant performance gains for blacks, but has resulted in greater racial animosity in the desegregated school. I hope this helps the viewer sees civil rights in a new way. It really is absurd how anyone can think that whites are anything but the least racist race. And it's amazing because whenever anyone says something about racism, right? What is the archetype of the racist? It's a white guy. Right? The racist is a white guy, probably a little bit overweight. He's a rural white, right? Rural white. This is more anti-rural white bigotry. Probably overweight. I mean, in his 40s or 50s, right? That's the archetype of the racist. It's a white guy. And this is really, really odd. And it's a product of conditioning, and it's a product of movies, it's a product of storytelling, right? It's a product of the whole mythology of civil rights. Reality is that white people are the least racist race by a very wide margin. You look at interracial adoption statistics, it's always white people adopting someone of another race. No other race does this in any significant numbers. And I'll have links to this to back up every empirical fact that I say. You can look at affirmative action. Whatever your opinions are on affirmative action, it's only whites that are doing this. Okay? Where in countries where whites are majorities, it is whites who are supporting these affirmative action policies. Affirmative action in universities, affirmative action in getting government contracts, in government jobs, and in labor codes. That is, if you don't have a certain number of black people, Mexican people, or whatever in your job or in your business or whatever, you're subject to lawsuits, or it's more likely for you to get sued. So you have firms trying to get the token black guy or the token whoever just so they can stave off a few lawsuits. And what this does is this crowds out better qualified white people. So, and you have and you have this going on in white majority countries. This is I've read a lot of history, and I haven't heard of any. I haven't read anything this widespread. This where the majority population grants legal privileges to a minority that is out of power. Okay, see, I can understand, like, for example, in a country where you have this autocratic elite that's granting their minority group privileges, but that's because they have control of the state. See, what's happening in white countries is unprecedented. You have these white people who are in control of the state, who are just giving away, just pissing away their power. It's really quite amazing. And I think it's an awful thing. But to say that white people are racist, that's quite... I don't know how anyone can even think that. You can also look at South Africa, for example, where you had this white minority that was in power, and as a result, South Africa was the richest country in Africa, south of the Sahara. And what did the whites do? Well, the whites gave up this power. Right? It wasn't that the blacks marshaled some big armies and then fought against the whites. It was the whites gave up the power. Now, Noam Chomsky says, well, this is because the corporations the economy changed, and that the corporate interests no longer wanted basically a slave population, that they wanted, a different type of population. They wanted more black engineers and black all that stuff. Now, which I think is kind of silly, because, like, has that happened? Where are these black engineers in South Africa? They're not. They don't exist. They do. A few do, but Chomsky's theory has been largely proved to be incorrect. But anyway, even if there's, like, corporate interests lobbying for this stuff, ultimately it was still the white people who were voting for it, right? And it was still the whites voted to give up power to the blacks. So. And of course, white South Africans are super racist. And I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's very rare that a group would just willingly give up power like this. They weren't run out of power. They gave it away. And they're supposed to be racist? You can also look at decolonization, where you had these white countries that, were basically controlling Africa, and controlling Southeast Asia, and controlling India. And they basically gave it up. They basically gave it away. They weren't run out. They weren't defeated. Like the British Army or the French Army, they weren't defeated in the battlefield and run out by some native armies that rose up against them. No, the natives just protested, and then back home they asked, well, should we give them a chance to secede, allow them to vote on their independence? And said, yes, okay, they can vote on their independence. And they said, yes, we want to be independent. And of course the result has been disastrous for Africa. Right? Because no longer was it white rule, it was black rule. And of course the result has been disastrous, just as it has been in South Africa, right, where you went from white rule to black rule, and you got to see the destruction of the economies in real time. And this kind of And another thing to think about is that the colonies, that a great motivation for the colonies was the idea that these European states needed to go into these places and help these black Africans. That it was through white rule that these black Africans would be better off, and that the British Empire was really quite a humanitarian organization. And you can say that that's wrong. On many counts, you could say that it's wrong that it's not Britain's job to go around the world and to save the world from itself, or something like that, and I would agree. But you really can't say it's wrong in a description of what happened, of Britain going into these areas, raising life expectancies, raising standards of living, and of course when the British left, it all went to shit. Okay? I mean, that is in fact what happened. So on one level, the idea of the white man's burden was, true. It did go to crap when the British Empire went away. And if you look at neoconservatism, you will find a lot of lobbying. You find a lot of rent-seeking, like all these oil companies trying to get no-bid contracts, like Halliburton getting no-bid contracts to go in, cost-plus pricing. The whole war racket, you have all that. But you also had an ideological movement behind the neoconservative movement, and that was the idea of spreading democracy, having global democracy, sacrificing ourselves to bring democracy to the brown people around the world. It's actually quite an altruistic campaign. In fact, a lot of the early neocons were Trotskyites. And of course, Trotsky wanted a global revolution to spread communism around the world. The next closest thing to communism is, of course, democracy. And, of course, democracy is like communism because it assumes everything is ultimately collectively owned, hence it can be voted on. So democracy is basically a form of communism. It is. So, and that's where the neoconservatives came from. And their idea was to spread democracy, a.k.a. communism, to a lesser degree, around the world. And a lot of people have interpreted this as a horribly racist and evil thing, when really the foundations of this movement are anything but. And you can also see this in Great Britain ending the slave trade, because Great Britain, most powerful navy in the world, had the ability to cut off the sea lanes anywhere, and they did. They had a global boycott on slavery, and basically shut down the global slave trade, and virtually, caused slavery to wither on the vine around the world. So, and Britain is, of course, a white country, so it was a white country that ended the global slave trade. And on slavery, even when it was occurring, what a lot of people don't know is that about as many slaves came from Africa, about as many slaves came from East Africa and were sent to the Arabs, to the Arab world, to be as slaves there, as were sent to the Americas. About as many were enslaved by the Arabs as were sent to the Americas. Now, that poses a problem. Well, if as many slaves were sent to the Arab world as to the Americas, why don't we see all these Africans in the Middle East? Well, the reason is that the Arabs castrated the males and did not allow the females to reproduce. They worked them all to death, okay, and did not allow them to reproduce. And so now they don't have a large black population. They don't have a problem of this resentful black population demanding equal rights or demanding affirmative action or demanding any of that crap. They don't have that problem because they killed them all. And who's remembered as the racist? The Arabs who killed them all, or the whites who merely enslaved them? The whites are. Because just imagine for a moment, just imagine if the white Europeans killed all the slaves. What would we be thinking now in the U.S. if the U.S. was only white and Hispanic? Basically, U.S. would be like what, 80% white and like 20% Hispanic and Asian or whatever. What if that was the demographics of the U.S.? What would we be saying about slavery today? It would be a historical tidbit. We wouldn't really even be thinking about it. Like say all the slaves were killed in the year 1800, right? Well, a lot of people would have died, right? That would be the memory. Like a lot of people were killed, and that was it. Right? We wouldn't really be thinking about it much today. But because they were not massacred, we do think about it much today, and whites are perceived as more racist than if whites actually killed them all. Right? That's the insanity of this, and that's the insanity that happens when you lack historical perspective. When you lack historical perspective of how uniquely unracist whites were. And you can also look at white countries allowing in mass immigrants of not of skilled technicians, not of doctors, not just of skilled people, but of just mass migrants into their countries. For example, in Finland, rape was not entirely unheard of, but it was virtually unheard of. Most people never viewed rape as being a problem until the mass importation of Africans to Finland. They imported the third world, and oh look, parts of Finland are becoming like the third world. And what's more is that I know in Finland, if you're an African and you don't have a job, you actually get more welfare than if you are a native Finn and don't have a job. And I guess the idea behind this is that Africans in Finland face racial discrimination because those Finns, right? They're Finns in their long history of racism, right? Right. I mean, it's amazing how anti-racist and ethno-masochist whites around the world are, and to say that whites are the most racist it's sick. It's sick and it's cruel to say something like that.